All right, so a quadratic is any equation with an x to the second power, and one of the ways to solve them is to graph them like this, and then if you look at this graph, how many solutions does this one have?
Only one.
One solution. Why is there only one solution?
Because that's how many times it crosses the x.
That's how many times it crosses the x-axis. So the solution to this is what? 3, 0. All right? So the solution to this is 3, 0. What about this parabola? All right, imagine that this is right here and this is right here. How many solutions does this have? 2. What are they?
Negative 2, 0. Negative 8, 0.
Okay. What do you notice all those have in common? They have a 0 in the y spot. So when you're looking for an answer to a quadratic, the answer to a quadratic is whatever makes it so that y will equal 0. So take this equation to begin with that we just did. So if I plug in 3, what will happen? So 3 squared minus 6 times 3 plus 9 equals 0. What's 3 squared? Minus what's 6 times 3? Plus 9. What's 9 minus 18? Negative 9 plus 9. Okay, so this is the number 3 that you can plug in that makes the equation equal to 0. So we want to figure out what numbers you can plug in to make the equation equal to 0. If you have your phone out right now, please put it away. Okay, so one of the ways to do that is by graphing. Another way that we can do that is by factoring. So again, this is just a slide that says everything I just said. So remember from the last lessons that the solutions to a quadratic function are where the y equals 0. So again, the zeros of the function. Okay? Now, the zero product property is something you guys all know. You might not ever call it this. But what that means is anything times 0 gives you what? 0. Okay? So if I do 5x equals 0, what does x have to be? 0. X would have to be 0. What if I did 5 plus x times x equals 0? What would x have to be? 0. It would have to be 0. What if I did well, it can't be 0 because what's 5 plus 0? So that would be 5, and 3 minus 0 is, so that would give you 15. So it can't be those. All right, Diego, your immediate reaction was 5. Why did you say 5?
Because I kind of skipped over the parentheses.
Okay.
3 minus x. So just automatically.
You're not like super wrong though. That you're close.
What you would do is distribute it.
I could do all that, or I can look at this and I can say, how many factors do we have here? 2, right? And if the whole thing has to equal 0, that means one of these factors has to be what? 0. What could I plug into x to make this 0? Negative 5. What could I plug into x to make this 0? 3 minus 3. So then that means how many solutions do I have here? I have 2. X could be negative 5 or x could be 3, and both of those would make the equation equal to what? 0. This looks kind of familiar, right? This is 2 what? 2 binomials, which we get when we factor a quadratic trinomial. All right, so think back to what we did last quarter. This is what we're going to talk about today. All right, so let's take a look at a couple more of these. What could I plug in for x that would make this 0? How many solutions do you think I'm going to have? 2. Why? I have 2 factors, so either one of them could be 0, right? Because as long as one of them is 0, the whole thing is going to be 0. Okay, so what could I plug into this factor to make it 0? What could I plug into this one to make it 0? So how many answers do I have? 2. All right, what about here? many factors do I have here? 2. I have 2. This is a factor, and this is a factor. What would make this factor 0? -5. What would make this factor 0? 0. So how many answer choices do I have? 2, but one of them just so happens to be 0. Okay? So all of this comes to what we're going to do next. So when you're looking at these problems, the goal is always to figure out what can make y equal to 0, because that's where the parabola will cross the y-axis. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to go back and do it again, but okay. So can you zone in? All right. So again, I'm not going to go back, but just if you're still lost at the end, you'll have time to practice, okay? All right. So here, how many factors do I have? 2. What are they? X and x minus 5. One of them has to be 0, right? Do both of them have to be 0?
They can.
They could be, but they don't both have to be, right? Just one of them has to be, because as long as one is 0, the whole thing would be 0. What would make this 0? 0. What would make this 0? +5. So what are my options? Those are my answers, 0 or +5. How come this is a +5 when it's a -5 here? It'll cancel out. It would do the opposite. Yep.
Is that the way you would write the answer?
Yes. So your answer would be x equals 0 or 5.
Isn't that kind of like writing it in coordinate form?
You can't write it in coordinate form, because if I write this, 0, 5, then it makes it look like x is 0, but y is 5. You could write it like this.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Like, put the y.
Yeah, you could write it like that. Okay, as long as your y's are both 0. I think it's probably easiest to just write it like that, but. All right, but how do we get from something like this to that? Esme? Yeah, you simplify by factoring, right? So go back to a month ago, all right? And we've got a quadratic trinomial here, right? And we've got to factor it, which means we need to break it up. What does it break into? 2 binomials. So I always write my 2 empty parentheses. And this one's an easier one because the first term is just x squared. So that means what would it be here? Not 2x. Just x and x. All right, so there's an x in each parentheses because what's x times x? X squared. Okay, now how do I figure out what goes here?
Well, it has to.
Emily?
You look at the third.
The c?
Yeah.
So we look at the c.
You find the multiple.
Okay. Yeah, what multiplies to c that adds up to b? So what multiplies to c that adds up to b? And remember, this one's easier because this doesn't have a number in front. So what multiplies to 10 that adds up to 7? 5 and 2. And both of them would be what? Positive. So 5 and 2. So f of x equals this. So then how many answers am I going to have? 2. So x must equal what? Either -5 or -2. Okay, so you've got 2 answers. So the first thing you're doing is going back to what we did before. We're factoring. We're breaking it down. Okay? Once you've broken it down, you've got 2 answers. But they're not just whatever the number is. They have to be the opposite of it. What would happen if you had something like this? How many answer choices would you have?
You have 3.
No. Still 2. What would be the first one? -3. Okay, the first one's still simple. What's going on with the second one? What's different? Has a coefficient. So what does that mean? That I can't just plug in +5, right? Because if I plug in +5, that will give me 10 minus 5, which is 5. So how do I figure out what makes that 0? we're going to have to do some division. Here's how you set it up. You would say, okay, I want to know what makes this 0. So how do I figure out how to get x by itself? Add 5. And that leaves you with what? And then how do you finish that? So then you end up with x equals, and I just leave this alone, 5 over 2. So those are your two options. All right? So if it's just like this, it's just the opposite. If it's a little more complicated, you can set it equal to 0. Or, does anyone see any type of shortcut you could take here between 5 over 2 and this? Brendan?
I think I see it.
Okay.
They just take the coefficient and
Uh-huh. Take this, put it on top. Take this, put it on the bottom. And then the sign should be opposite. Okay? So the opposite of this over this. And it'll always work that way. It will always work that way. So if it were like 3x minus 8, it would be x equals 8 over 3. Okay? Yeah.
if it was positive,
It'd be like 2x plus 4. Then it would be x equals negative 4 over 2. Which you could simplify. But, yep. Okay, so let's try this one together. What's wrong with b? It's not in standard form, so what do I need to do with it? Simplify it, get it into standard form. So what do I have to move? The 8, how do I move an 8? Subtract it. So then standard form would look like what? Okay, and now I have to
you have to
put it in.
form.
These are called what? Binomials. This is a simple one, right? So this just is what? X and x. Okay, something that's going to multiply to negative 8 that adds to 2. So what would multiply to negative 4 and 2? Almost.
I mean, negative 2, 4.
Negative 2 and 4. Why is it negative 2 and positive 4 and not the other way around?
Because
You need to get a plus 2, so the 4 is the bigger one, has to be positive. Okay, so am I done or do I need an answer?
we have to
How many answers?
2,
2? What are they?
Positive 2 and negative 1.
Good. Why didn't I have to do any like hard lifting there?
because there's no coefficient.
Yeah, there's no coefficients, so that one's easier. It's just simple, just do the opposite. So this is your answer. I see people all the time stop right here. All right? Don't. That's the hard work, but this is the answer. So I can't give you points if you stop right here. You've got to give me the actual answer. Okay? Is this one in standard form? Yes? Okay, so what does that give me? X and x. Okay, and then what? 1 times 1, because doesn't that add up to 2? Yeah? So plus 1 and plus 1, and that equals 0. So how many choices do I have? I only really have 1. Why? Because it's the same thing. And what would it be? Negative 1. Perfect. So you could say negative 1 or negative 1, but there's only 1 because they're exactly the same. Guillermo?
Wait, so you put the opposite on the...
Yes. Because that's what you would plug in to make this what? What would, if I plugged in, yeah. And you want it to be 0 because remember on the graph, where are our answers? Where the y's are 0, right? So that's why the goal is always to get it equal to 0. So you always want it equal to 0, which is why you have to get it over here in standard form. Okay, so there are a lot up here. The first 6 are already factored for you. So the first 6, you're just finding the answers that you would need to plug in. So again, if they don't have a coefficient, it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. If they do have a coefficient, like here, that one would be a little bit different, okay? Opposite over the first term. Opposite of the second over the first.
We do all of them?
Yes, you're gonna do all of them. You have like the rest of class. So 26 to 31, you have to get in standard form first. 20 to 25, you're just finding the answers. Brendan,
I still have to finish my
you were supposed to come at lunch, so
You are?
yes. All right. Okay, any other questions? Go. I'm gonna go back.